Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to your webinar on the IMEF initiative. Today, we are more than 200 attending, and it is fantastic so many of us coming together, collaborating, sharing, discussing the issue on our carbon footprint, agreeing on the way forward. We have a chat box where you can write questions you might have. And I must also mention, we are presenting this initiative next week in Singapore. In a world where we are constantly online and available, I personally find myself in information mode, gathering and giving. Most of you will recognize when going for a run, bike ride or walk, you want to know the distance, the time, elevation, perhaps improved time or personal record. You gather this information and data compared to your effort to improve the next time. How does this relate to today? Well, daily we are buying or using things, and I'm guilty when I say I look at price, quality, perhaps the brand. I don't ask how far has this traveled, how did it travel, who produced it. Some years back, not thinking or understanding that I leave my personal environmental footprint. Needless to say, today we understand, and it matters, and it must in this day and age. I should want to make an effort and a personal goal of knowing my cause and effect, not just about how fast or far I run to post on social media or tell my friends. This personal environmental footprint affects my family and friends and our future generation, even if it's just a drop in the ocean. Now translate this into decisions, big decisions at work, where we procure and use. This is where you come in. Then this becomes much bigger. And the IMEF initiative is born out of what's coming. The rules and regulations on carbon footprints and emissions are already here because it affects us all. The vision is that we can agree on how we measure our environmental footprint with the most precise and available data. We have already established a working group consisting of some large ship owners, managers, caterers, manufacturers, large trading platforms, ship suppliers, membership organizations, who all will work together defining initial data points to be measured and managed. This will work in progress. This will be work in progress, so stay tuned. Now, before I hand over to my sidekick today, Rasmus, I have to say this. The IMPA SAVE pledge was born out of a thought to do the right thing without having the right data. Rasmus actually challenged this, but luckily the data was overwhelming, and for me personal, an introduction to measuring the carbon footprint emissions and driving future decision making was born, and the idea of IMEF started taking shape. So again, thank you all for joining today. Let's do the right thing together and do what we can, because we must. Over to you, Rasmus.
Thank you very much, Mikael. Thank you for the introduction. I have the honor today to dive a little bit deeper into the framework. We need to talk a little bit about the framework and the whole idea behind the framework, and also on a practical note, how do you actually dive in there? But first of all, let me know if everything goes through. And if there is anybody who are having a hard time within the focus or the presentation or anything, you're welcome to just write it in the chat. But right now you should be able to see me and some slides. If not, you can tweak it inside Teams. But if we start off the methodology and the practical application, today I also have an example of a calculation that we're going to look at. And then we can have a good Q&A. And already see, if you go into the Q&A box, there are some good questions in there. And please help us all out, because we're here for you as well, to add some questions. If you have questions or something that is not clear to you, feel free to add them in the Q&A, and we will take them in the end and answer them to the best of our ability. Back to myself, my name is Rasmus. I'm the founder and CEO of environmental engineering and software company called Reflow. Besides that, I have the honor to be part of the IMPA SAVE Council, and then I'm also appointed EU climate-backed, European climate-backed ambassador, focusing on the ever-changing initiatives and all the amazing initiatives that are currently being introduced in EU within the maritime space. But before I dive into the IMEF initiative, I think it's very important we all are on the same page on what is Scope 3, and also more importantly, why is it so important? And I think this will bring us all on the same terms, and we have a good idea about what is required, both as a ship owner, because this is also part of the initiative that Mikael touched base on, that we need to be able to have the same footing in terms of how is it we share this data. But first of all, let's figure out what it is and why it's important, and then we dive into the initiative. So the first slide I just brought in from the side is just explaining what is Scope 3 and what is not Scope 3, and I think that is super important. So when you look at scopes of emission, this is based on an old framework called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and it was meant to divide emissions up to different scopes. Now, when we talk IMEF, we talk Scope 3, and Scope 3 is different than the two other scopes, and I'll get into that. So Scope 1 is all about direct emissions to air. So this could typically, if you're a ship owner, be emissions emitted directly to the air from the combustion of your fuel. That is Scope 1. Super important if you're a ship owner, and also a big focus area on the fuels, because typically on a vessel, this is super important. I have an example a little bit later on Scope 1 and Scope 3 for the ship owners on a specific vessel we can look at. Now there's also Scope 2. And Scope 2 is typically energy, heating, and cooling that is derived from another source. So let's say if you are a ship owner, this could be the emissions you generate from shore power if you are using that. Now, everything else is called Scope 3. This is quite interesting because the Scope 3 also includes all the supply chain materials that you generate as a supplier, but also what you buy as a ship owner. Now, Scope 1, fairly easy to calculate. You know what to measure. It is something related to fuel consumption typically. Scope 2, you measure the electricity you have from shore power. But do you really measure all the materials and all the activities you have with all of your suppliers? Typically, no. So this is the big topic of today. But before we dive in on how to calculate this on products, then we need to have a step back and look into something also very important, and that's the reason why. Why is this suddenly becoming more and more relevant? To get the answer, we need to look at some new initiatives. This one I brought in is called CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. This directive is part of the EU Green Deal. European Union have introduced a deal where they get close to what's called net zero within 2055. Now, in order to do this, they need to have some plans in place for the European Union. One of those plans is called the CSRD Directive, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. This initiative is part of a big suite of different initiatives. There's also something called EU taxonomy, and that is the language. So what is green, what is not green? That's also important. We speak the same language. And then EU has also come up with something called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And this is all about knowing your customers and do the due diligence in terms of your supply chain and customers. But rewinding back to the CSRD, one of the biggest changes that we have seen within the maritime industry or for maritime producers and ship owners is that over the next couple of years, EU will require larger entities to begin with to start reporting on their Scope 3 emissions. And if you remember the prior slide, we saw that this can be very confusing and also very difficult. If you are a ship owner, you can have up towards 2,000 or 3,000 suppliers. So actually having a good understanding of the emissions you get in can be very challenging. And this is exactly why we have introduced the IMEF initiative. Now, where does the IMEF initiative fit in when we talk about a ship owner trying to be compliant? And I think this is a slide I brought in just to see where is it actually it follows along the whole decarbonization, but also more importantly, the compliance pathway for ship owners. Now, the ship owners are typically going through, in order to be compliant, through 5 steps. The first one is to figure out where are they today, called a gap analysis. The next one is to what is relevant for us as a ship owner to report on. Because now part of this CSRD reporting initiative is also a lot of measuring points. I believe up to, 1,100 measuring points. So not all measuring points are relevant for ship owners. So some of these, they need to document that they're more relevant than others. So they have to do an assessment called double materiality assessment. And what they believe is relevant will be part of their integrated report, where both their financials and their environmental sustainability focused data will be combined together. Now, the other part, that's the step number 3, is what's called scope 3 data, or typically we see ship owners using something called spend-based data. Now, the spend-based data differs from the IMEF initiative on one very important area. When you calculate scope 3 using a spend-based approach, you calculate using your financial spend over a given time period times an emission factor. So you have 2 variables. One, how much have I bought within a category within a given year? That's your spend. And then you have an emission factor that is good enough to cover this category. So let's say it is supplies sent to the ship. Now, naturally, these emission spend factors are not adapted to the maritime industry. So what you need to do is to adapt some emission spend-based factors that are close enough. So as a ship owner, you have 2 variables, the emission factor and the spend. Now, what happens if the spend goes up? Let's say we have inflation or the product's more expensive, or perhaps as a ship owner, you're looking into say, let's buy some products that have a better quality and a longer life. Now, then you actually get penalized in your emission reporting if you're using a spend-based approach. So does this really make sense if you are trying to decarbonize, diving into either buying better quality or buying products that uses some different low carbon materials, or other activities like logistics that might be using greener fuels? Probably not, because chances are you're increasing your spend a little bit. But the worst thing is you don't have enough granularity of data to make the right choices, or at least justify them. And this is the major point, and why the IMEF initiative is anchored into a whole different way of looking at your calculations. At the IMEF initiative, we are using something called the activity-based approach. The activity-based approach is all about the activity of the product. So what actually happened with the product? And this is going to be explained by me in details when we dive further in a little bit. Now, just to finish the roadmap for a ship owner, after they have done the spend-based, they have got a good enough picture of their emissions, something they can use to report. But the next thing is they also need to get data on the vessels themselves, because chances are they buy and sell vessels within the given fiscal year. So this is also something they need to figure out. The last thing, when they start acting in terms of strategies and so on, they have figured out, and this is what many ship owners are figuring out right now, is the spend-based is not good enough for a decarbonization strategy, but it's good enough for minimum compliance. So what many ship owners are focusing on now is to engage with suppliers. Engaging with suppliers is very crucial for them, because now they can get climate data directly from the suppliers and not via this spend-based approach. So if a supplier is introducing greener products, the ship owner will be able to benefit from this in terms of lowering their emissions on their scope 3. Now, Scope 3, as we already realized in these few slides, can be very complex. So let's dive in and see why it is complex. Now, as a ship owner or as a supplier, you are a part of a bigger puzzle. If we look at the supplier perspective, as you can see here on the far right or the far left, you are able to see the suppliers. And you as a supplier will fit into the supply chain of the vessel, both from the new building of the vessel, but also through the maintenance of it. So you are required as a supplier in order for the ship owners to get better data to supply the product carbon footprint of what they buy. In this case, you will be able to see supplier 1, 2, and 3 are supplying in this case, another supplier. That could be the shipyard. Now, the shipyard is combining their emissions with the product emissions, and they will then say these are the emissions for the vessel itself. Now, if we are looking at spare parts or maintenance of a vessel, then you will be able to, if you're dealing directly with the ship owners, you will then be required to submit the data not to the shipyards, but directly to the ship owners. And this can be quite challenging because if you don't have clear guidelines, you don't have clear instructions on how to calculate and how to share the data will be useless, both for the ship owner, for yourself, and for everybody else in the value chain. Because remember, the ship owners will also need to report this data to their customers. So it is very crucial that we all report, but we also share and calculate data the right way. Now let's try and dive into an example of why is Scope 3 very important. Now here we have an example of a ship owner. This is a snapshot of an example today. Here we have a vessel. As I mentioned earlier, as a ship owner, the Scope 1, meaning the fuel of emissions from the combustion of the fuel, is very important. And as you can see here, the Scope 1 might be up to 92, 95, depending on what type of vessel and the operational profile. So that leaves the rest to the value chain, means the shipbuilding and the maintenance of the vessel. Minor importance, right? And that's also why ship owners are focusing a lot on the fuels. But we can also agree on the fuel change is not something that happens overnight. But decarbonization of products, picking the low-hanging fruits, incorporating renewable energy or green steel might happen faster than building a whole new ecosystem of green fuel. So this is why many ship owners are both focusing on the supply chain and the green fuel at the same time. Thus, then can they, get the easy winnings first from the products and then over time make a big change with the fuels. We call that organic decarbonization, when the suppliers are supplying greener materials or greener products to the ship owner without they have to put a specific strategy in place. This is something that is happening over time. Now, what happens if we start adding green fuel to the vessel? Adding green fuel, in this case green methanol, will lower the overall emissions in the high double digits. In this case, from what I brought in here, it's about 73, it could be 78, it could be 90, all depending on the vessel. So we're seeing an overall reduction of the emissions. But if we leave the rest of the supply chain unchanged, you will then be able to see that the building and the maintenance of the vessel will increase in importance because these emissions are the same. But if we start lowering the fuel emissions, the importance of the rest of the vessel life cycle will increase substantially. So this is also saying, yes, we are decarbonizing on a short term, it's important, but on a longer term, it's even more important to be able to supply this data because this will be the next important decarbonization area for many ship owners. So how do you actually calculate the emissions and how do you actually use the IMEF initiative? Now, the IMEF initiative is set up on three steps. First, we encourage all the users of IMEF to calculate. Here, we are using a product carbon footprint approach, saying you need to calculate the emissions of your product. Over time, we might align with the other initiatives from ISO, from EU, to create a more global reaching. But today, it's also very important for us to catch as many as possible within the initiative to make sure we don't overcomplicate it from the get-go. So we have also set it a very low, you could say, ambitions right now. Well, what we have done is fairly easy for everyone to work with, but over time the ambitions will go up. At least that is our hope, is that we all together in the working groups will come together and say will make sense to move the IMEF initiative to align with global standards. But aligning with global standards will also increase the complexity. So risking increasing the complexity early on might make it difficult for many to join. So we are starting with a good enough approach, focusing on product carbon footprint, not taking the entire life cycle into perspective, but that might be something we will do later, as I just mentioned. The next step is for the suppliers, manufacturers, is to reduce, because now they will start getting a more granular understanding of the data that makes out their product. So we will over time see manufacturers that are picking the low-hanging fruits that I mentioned earlier. In this case, it could be the green electricity or the green steel or even some other materials, because now you'll have data. You will see for yourself as a manufacturer, as a supplier, where is it my emissions are originating from within my product. Naturally, the whole idea with the IMEF initiative is also to be able to report this data to your customers, in this case, the ship owners or ship chandlers or others that are in the supply chain. If you have questions, again, you can add them in the Q&A box. So there should be a Q&A box inside the Teams window, and you will be able to add them in there. I can also try and look in the chat, but I think if it works in the side, the Q&A box, use them in there. Now let's move on and let's look at the an example of a calculation. I think it's important we just look at an example. This is an example of how a calculation could look like, but this is even more, here you have more data than what we actually require in the IMEF, but it's just to put in this example here, you will see the manufacturing emissions, and these are the emissions we have agreed for within the IMEF initiative in the beginning is good enough for the suppliers to create a better baseline than the spend-based. So the manufacturing emissions here are calculated. You'll be able to see that 4,141 kilos of CO2 equivalents is the manufacturing emissions. You will also be able to see the top materials, or in this case, they call it parameters, but the emission materials or activities that goes into the manufacturing of the product. So here you can also see there are some raw materials, there are some electricity, there is also natural gas being used, and then there are some logistics elements as well that have been calculated in this example. So once you start getting this granularity of data, you'll be able to decarbonize, because you will also be able to say, what if I use a different type of cast iron, a type of cast iron that has more recycled materials in there, and I can document that in my calculation. Well, then you will see the emissions will lower. And this is the whole scenario-based thinking that is very good for the decarbonization of materials. And that is exactly what we are looking for in the IMEF initiative over time. So let's go through a few steps on how to make an example of this calculation. And again, please ask questions and we will do them as we will answer them here at the end. Now, the first step is to create a goal and a scope. What is it you're calculating and what is it you're including in your calculation? So in this case, you're choosing your product, but you're also choosing what is it we're calculating and what are what we call boundaries. And in the IMEF initiative, we have some clear boundaries saying we are calculating something called cradle to gate. That means we are calculating the manufacturing production emissions of a product. That is what we have included in the initial version of the IMEF initiative. You also, in this, say, okay, I want to calculate the carbon footprint. And then you adhere yourself to a methodology. In this case, it's called Recipe 2016. And then you are choosing something called Global Warming Potential 100. And that's aligned with the international or the European, with the United Nations Panel for Climate Change, IPCC, on how they're calculating climate change. The next step is called step number 2. This can be challenging for many out here, and that is the data collection. So data collection is all about collecting the activities that goes into making this calculation. So for manufacturers, this will be an overview. Typically, you will get this from the bill of material of your product, the BOM, BOM. And this will include, so what went into the, what goes into the to the processes, how much steel is included, what type of steel, are there any machining, are there any energy consumption? Now, I also think at this point, it's all about weighing a little bit and say, how much detail do I have as a manufacturer? And I'm not saying you need to include, and I think that's very important, is we also need to be transparent about what we include in this calculation. There might be data that is unavailable. You can still make the calculation, but then it's very important to be transparent and say, we were not able to get all the data on the O-rings, the fittings, and all the other things, but we have included this and this from the bill of material with the major activities. Because we will see that some data is not available for certain suppliers or manufacturers. And this is also why the IMEF initiative is not either you're compliant or you're not, and you cannot be part of the initiative unless you can calculate all your products. This is not what the IMEF initiative is all about. The IMEF initiative is all about making a joint framework and agreeing on how do we do this, right? So now I'm showing an example on how you can do it, but it's also very important for this initiative that we come together and not make it too complex in the beginning. And we all are joining forces as ship owners, as ship chandlers, as suppliers, as part of the entire value chain. As Mikael said in the beginning, it's all about meeting, coming together to make a difference. But if we don't do it, we will end up seeing frameworks from outside the maritime industry being imposed on our industry that can be much more complex and typically made out of different industry standards. So this is also a calling to say, yes, it is complex. You will undoubtedly see that there are some suppliers that are not able to supply this data at this point. But unless we have guidelines and examples and an initiative like this, we don't know what direction to go in. If you go into the next step, input your data. Here there are platforms, there are softwares. We also see some are using spreadsheets. You can make the calculation. What is very important is you're very transparent about your choices and where the data originates from and the method and so on that goes into making the calculation. Now, once you're done, you have made the calculation, you will then hit the calculation button and all the emission factors will be multiplied with the activities. And in here, you will see the total carbon footprint of your product within the given scope. And that will give you a result. And here we see the results. This is made from a platform, but you can also use, again, other platforms, other softwares. Now, this is not special for the maritime industry. All the methods that are and the approach that are described in the IMEF initiative is not adhering to specific maritime approaches. These are all being adopted and used somewhere else. So it's not something that is specific for the maritime industry. You can also use different platforms and different methods on how to do this. So hopefully we've reached the point now where we got an understanding of the vision and goal of IMEF from Mikael. I have done my very best to explain a little bit about the framework itself, but also more importantly, why is this important? And I think that is really important. We need to understand the context of why the IMEF initiative is here, but also understanding that the scope 3 is here to stay. It is not something that is being removed overnight and say, oh, this was just a wrong initiative and it will not be rolled out. And the reason why is that if you are a manufacturing company, up towards 95% of your total emissions or 90% of your total emissions will originate from your scope 3 supply chain. It will be your raw materials that you're using in production. and so on and so on. So a lot of your materials and a lot of your emissions as a company will originate from your supply chain. And with that focus, European Union have agreed that the scope 3 need to be accounted in if we are to make a change within the European Union. So that's why it's very relevant for suppliers and for companies that needs to adhere to the CSRD initiative that I first started out of explaining. So thank you very much for your time. Now we've had 30 minutes diving into the IMEF initiative. And I also actually can see some questions, and I think Mikael and I will have time to actually go through them. So I'll just remove the screen sharing, and then we can jump into the questions.
Yeah, Rasmus, I'll leave it to you to read them just so you understand the questions. There are 2 good questions on the chat.
Yeah, I can already see they are popping in here. I think we'll start from the top on the Q&A. We have received some questions earlier before we started, so we can just go through those. We have a question here. Is it feasible to calculate a global carbon footprint for products in the supply chain, given the diverse production methods and supply chains across different regions? Now, the idea is to say, is it feasible? Yes. I think the challenge, as I also explained earlier, is the data. Because in order to make a calculation, you will need to have an understanding of what goes into making the product. And if you're a ship chandler, you might have 3 chains of suppliers, and you don't have contact necessarily to the main supplier somewhere. So this will be challenging for you as a ship chandler. This is also why joining an initiative like IMEF, sending out guidelines through your supply chain, will be an important first step for you. Now, as a manufacturer, you will probably have a good idea of what goes into your product. You might have your own recipe on how to make the product called the bill of materials. But your challenge here could be to have a good understanding of the amount of products and the energy consumption that goes in, especially if you manufacture some in Asia, some in Europe, and so on. Now, in order to make it less complex, because the problem can also be you as a manufacturer will need to go back to your supplier somewhere and get the data. And they might not be ready either, right? So the raw material suppliers might not have the data either. So to make it less complex, we have agreed that as part of the guidelines, you can also use what's called a background database. The background database that we have included in the initial part of this initiative is called EcoInvent. And the EcoInvent is a non-for-profit organization that have over the last many years compiled averages on regional, global, and global scale, and also on temporal scale. So you are able to select the data based on the average within a given region. So if you don't have the specific data for steel within your supply chain from your specific supplier, well, then the next step will be to share the IMEF guidelines on how you would like the data, and then you can use the EcoInvent data and add that to your calculation. But I think Mikael and I and the rest of the initiative, we agree this will be a complex task. That is also why we encourage everybody to start as soon as possible, so we can align with the supply chains. I got another one. Can you please clarify why the green fuel for scope 3 emissions increased so much in comparison with the conventional fuels? Yes. So when we look, and this is where it gets complicated. So what we can see right now is in IMO perspective, we don't account for the supply chain of your fuels. We're using something called tank to wake perspective. So we're just focusing on what comes out of the stack or out of the combustion of the fuel. Now, when we start moving into the life cycle perspective, when we start looking at calculating emissions on a vessel in a life cycle perspective, we include the life cycle of the production of the fuels as well. So this is where we include the the emissions of producing the different types of fuel. And remember, when we produce something, it's part of the supply chain. So this is why it's called Scope 3, and this is why it's important. So on the green fuels, the method on how to produce green fuels is not a standardized process yet. It can be produced in many ways with many different technologies. And some of the carbon capture methods that we have assessed also include different types of use of natural gas and other types of resources that will have a higher impact on the global warming potential. And that's why we see that some of the green fuels, they might be biogenic, meaning that they don't increase the global warming on the Scope 1, but they will leave a substantial footprint in the supply chain. That is why we will see a change from the Scope 1 to the Scope 3 on the green fuels. Yeah. Do you have any questions you can see in the chat, Mikael?
No, I think you covered the questions. There was one removed, but I also want to say, you mentioned the thing to get started, and this is complex. It's a whole new beginning on something, and maybe not for all, but for most of us. What I want to say is that the working group that we've established, and we will gather very, very soon, we will also hopefully come up with some guidelines for initial data points to be asked from the suppliers out there to their supply chain. So we all try to ask the same questions, so we all get the most correct answers. And we also are aware that we might not get it, but it will be a guidance paper that you can share down the supply chain from us. And what we are hoping with the IMEF initiative is that owners will onboard this, so we are all, as owners, managers, caterers, everyone belonging in the supply chain, are asking the same questions and moving together in the same directions, so we can steer this together and not asking various and different questions to the various suppliers out there. Because being a supplier for 20 years, I know how difficult it is with the different qualities and products you have in your supply chain to the different owners and managers you cater to or deliver to. So now adding this complex thing, as I call it, with emissions on every little product we deliver or is being bought, is challenging, Rasmus, and I think everybody in the call is aware of it. So personally, I want to thank you for this. I don't know if there's anyone out there listening in who needs further clarification, but I want to say this again: you can expect to get a guideline paper from us very, very soon that I encourage everyone to use going forward. And even if you want to add extra layers to it, you can do that. Just remember, as soon as you start adding extra layers, you start enhancing the complexity, and then it becomes a bit challenging for the suppliers out there. And we do have suppliers that are large who might have big organizations to support this, and we do certainly have suppliers that are much smaller and do not have maybe a set of extra hands to get this done.
We have another question here. What are the requirements to be a member of IMEF, and what are the expectations of being a member?
Yeah, so there's two things. First of all, it's a matter of showing support that you as a company, personal, will agree that this is the right way forward. And I think the more we come together around this, the more we can get done. So the requirements not very. There are no requirements then to sign up, and we will post afterwards on how to do this. The working group, we made a fairly large working group already, and we will revert on that soon. But we are trying to take the whole every little step involved in this process, both how to capture but also how to report, and this can be through training platforms, ERP systems. Without getting too much into detail, there's a lot of things that has to match together, and we're trying to piece this together in this group and work together to overcome any obstacles. And there will be obstacles, but we want to see if we can streamline this whole process, which I hope we will get done. But again, we haven't gotten the group together yet, but we have asked several people to be part of the group that we know can help us both on the data point, but also on deliverables electronically, which is going to be a wish for most of you. So yeah, so there's a lot of this.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think there is so many questions, which is great. And I see some of you have hands raised up. I would rather encourage you to submit your question in Q&A. And inside the Q&A, for those we don't answer, we will come back to you in writing with the answers, and we can also share some of them in the in our forum. How will information about product level emission be shared with other members? Now, I think I will say that it is not our intention within the IMEF initiative to start sharing data of people's products and calculations between people and different companies. I think in the working group, we can share best practices, but the carbon footprint of products will not be measured in this initiative against each other. It is between the suppliers and the parties sharing the data with each other. So if you're a supplier and you want to share the data with a ship owner, it's up to yourself. It is not on the table right now for the IMEF initiative to create any databases that compare different products, because then we also need to have a framework that allows for comparison. Right now, the IMEF initiative is for creating a declaration or a baseline calculation, but it's not detailed enough that we can start comparing data. That is not the idea.
And I think the comparison will be done by the individual owners and managers and companies who's buying it, that will be done. So I think the information will come directly from them to, I would say, the competing suppliers, if I might say so.
Yeah, I believe we can all agree that it's impossible to instantly go from 0 to 100% of your scope 3 emissions accounted for by the activity reporting method. Could ship owners use the activity-based method when applicable and account for the rest by using a spend-based model? If not, how will this gap be handled until everything is accounted for? And I will come up from the technical comment here. It is acceptable within the GHG protocol to use what's called a hybrid method. So identifying groups where you have data to use activity-based and use another method for where you don't have activity-based data. And then over time, being, of course, transparent on which groups are what, and then over time, enhancing your data by implementing the IMEF initiative. That is acceptable according to the GHG protocol. Good.
This is exactly what we wanted to achieve from this. You can start with spend-based as the baseline, but then it's our wish that we evolve it into an activity-based calculation.
Another question. We understand that emissions happening during logistic operations during supplies of spare parts and stores to vessels fall under scope 3. Is this above only parameter to be considered, or are there any other factors to be considered under scope 3? So I think from my presentation, we talked about product carbon footprint, right? And the product carbon footprint and the guidelines as we have right now through the IMPA IMEF initiative is saying we are looking at the emissions related to the production of the product. We have not agreed to, and this might be something we discuss in the working group, should we expand the scope to include logistics? Right now, it is a scope called cradle to gate. So you can include the logistics involved with the raw materials onto your factory, but from the factory to the customer, we have not included that in the IMEF initiative. But under the scope 3, and now I think we get confused, right? Scope 3 is when you report as a company. This is what the ship owners are reporting. Product carbon footprint, that is what the ship owners will need in order to calculate their scope 3. So the IMEF initiative is linked as an important tool to be able to supply data for the ship owners to calculate scope 3. But into making a product carbon footprint, you will use your energy consumption, your materials consumption, and so on, as outlined within the guidelines on the IMEF initiative website. Very good. A Good morning. Unfortunately, it seems that the industry, and this is another question / comment, is not ready for the detailed kind of reporting. For example, a lot of suppliers are not able to track and provide this kind of data, including transportation, storage, and packaging. Can you please advise on how to overcome those issues? So as we explained, what you really need to make a product carbon footprint is the raw materials and energy consumption that goes into the production of your product. We have not included transportation, storage, and all these things into the IMEF initiative yet. So these are definitely something you will need to align with your suppliers and start collecting data on your facilities, because this might be very important to provide a more full view of your product's emissions. So will be included, I'm sure, over time, but for now, it's only the cradle to gate emissions that are included. Got another one. Hello, thanks, and very clear about the calculation of a spare part. What about for very basic items represent a lot for ship chandlers? How do we calculate when we talk about racks, hand tools, etc., coming from Asia? So for all these minor products, the best scenario it will be to follow the IMPA or the IMEF initiative. And for what we have right now, you'll need the activity-based calculation. So you'll need to approach all the many suppliers of all these different materials in order to get their data. But as you probably know, it is not a possibility at the moment. So
but this is also,
yeah.
Rasmus, if I just may, and this is why we have a working group. We are going to provide with a document that we can agree on the working group that can be sent through the supply chain. So we're asking the right questions and the same questions. So when a ship chandler is, as the trader is buying a product from somewhere else, they will get the information on these guidelines on what you're really asking for, which they then have to source.
We got another one here. Where does CSRD compliance apply? Does it apply on the operations outside EU? And I think this is really, really a good question. So CSRD is a European Union initiative. And the whole idea with the EU is that they are the first runners right now in the world saying we need to account for scope 3 emissions. So as we see it right now, the CSRD is applicable for European ship owners that have registered entities within the EU. But as EU is putting into their roadmap, they will also include everybody exporting to the EU. So if you are having products you sell in the EU, or you're having offices or activities within the European Union, you will over time be applicable to report under the CSRD requirement. So we are also saying if you have an exclusive entity just dealing exclusively, or an exclusively dealing entity in Asia or in the US, where you don't have any customers at all that is related to the European Union, you might not fall under the CSRD, thus the scope 3 compliance. But we also see that as the CSRD will be expanded, and as we see other initiatives in the EU and other stock exchanges might be expanded, the scope 3 might be included. Because as I mentioned, most manufacturers around the world, over 90% of their emissions will be and is related to scope 3. So it is, in my opinion, as the way I see it, inevitable to actually get around the scope 3. We might buy ourselves the time if you are related or you're dealing outside the EU, but it will be affected if you have interest within the EU within the next couple of years. Cool. We have tons of questions, and I think what we will do is we'll go through the questions and we will answer them on a Q&A on the IMPA website, on the IMEF website. I will discuss that with you, Mikael, and we can take some of the questions there as a FAQ, and I think they're really relevant as well. Yeah. You have a last comment, Mikael?
No, I don't really have a comment. I think we covered a lot, and again, for some this might be very overwhelming. But I want to make one comment, and if I've gotten this right, Rasmus, because I think the question was maybe if you're based outside of the EU, can you then disregard this? But I do believe you're dealing with a European-based ship owner. You definitely have to provide these emissions because they need it for their reporting. So I don't know if that was the question, kind of a get out of jail card, as I call it, that we don't have to do it. But besides that, I just want to say thank you for everybody participating. I want to say thank you for you, Rasmus, for helping us getting even more knowledge on the direction here, even though I'm still confused by it all. I'm still learning every day on this. And I also want to say that if we got people listening in from Asia or traveling to Singapore next week, we will be presenting the IMEF initiative live at this event. So I welcome anyone from Asia, Singapore, who's going to be there next week to join the conference and be part of our talks.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And remember all the many questions, we will look at them and try and answer as good as possible and follow up on everything. So thank you so much for your time today. I'm so sorry we can't do any more questions, but it's overwhelming great to see so much support. So please go in if you haven't done so. Follow the IMEF, sign up as a follower, and let's start making a difference today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hi, and we are live here from Suntech in Singapore. I am Mikael Karlsson, sitting here with Rasmus from Reflow.
Hello, Mikael. Great to be here in Singapore.
Yeah, it's fantastic. We are here in connection with IMPA. I'm meeting a lot of owners and managers who has a lot of questions on what's coming from EU, which is not just considered EU, but it's going to be a global thing when it comes to our product carbon footprint, better known as PCF.
We actually got a lot of questions, which could be quite interesting to just touch base on today, right?
It is, and this is also from our webinar we had last week with over 100 participants. We had a ton of questions rolling in, and we had to finish the webinar before time. We couldn't answer everything, so we decided to sit down over a cup of coffee and have a conversation about some of these questions that I'd like to ask you, and then you answer to the best of your knowledge.
I will do my very best, Mikael, and you're absolutely right. I think let's try and touch base on some of the interesting questions, and you're absolutely right. There was I don't know if you call it frustration, but there was some questions for some of the participants, which would be great to just touch base on. Yeah, let's do it.
Let's just hit it off with the first one that's on my list here. Is it feasible to calculate a global carbon footprint for products in the supply chain given the diverse production methods and supply chains across different regions?
Yeah, I think let's look at this question. So is it feasible to calculate a global carbon footprint? So what we are discussing and what we're proposing in the IMEF initiative is to create what's called a product carbon footprint. So what that means is you're making a calculation based on the production of this product. So I don't know where the global part comes in, but of course the calculation will have to represent what is related to the production of it. But I think what the challenge here could be is to actually get the right data from the suppliers. So let's say you're a manufacturer or a ship chandler, how would you actually get the right data? Naturally, if you're a manufacturer, you will know what kind of raw materials and what kind of energy consumption that goes into it, but you will still need to get some data from these raw materials. Now, that might take time, and we see that many of these sub-suppliers are not ready yet. So what is acceptable to do in other industries, and also what we're proposing here in the IMEF initiative, is to use what's called a background database. So actually using an emissions database, which has been compiled over many, many, many years, and will have different values for different type of materials and regions. So if you don't have the data, you can actually use this, and it's called EcoInvent, and it's It's a non-profit organization in Switzerland which are offering this one.
Okay, thank you very much, Rasmus. I'm just trying to sift through here so we can get a kind of a direction so we don't fly all over the place, but I just figured out this is impossible. So I'm just going to hit off with another question here. Hello, and thank you very clear on about the calculations for spare parts. What about very basic items which represent a lot of ship chandlers? How can we calculate when we talk about racks, hand tools, etc., coming, for example, China?
Yeah, so I think the big thing with many of the smaller items is that that it will take time to actually engage with all these suppliers that make screwdrivers and hand tools and so on. And I think, let's face it, it won't happen overnight. So what is possible is to do engage with different companies and actually have some calculation made in the interim. So using this average method that we are proposed in the IMEF initiative, there is different database called eConvent, and if you look at eConvent, it contains over 20,000 different data sets. So if you look at eConvent and you can also look at other sources, it's actually possible to create some averages. And based on those averages, you can say 1 kilo of screwdriver, how much is that in emissions? And of course, the more detailed you can get in, say, cordless drill with lithium battery and so on, the better number you can get. That's called the proxy method. And that is what would be acceptable, I would say, in the beginning, and then it will buy you some time to actually go out and engage with your suppliers. But then a good advice would also be, talk to your customers. Which of these products is the most important part for them? I think a good advice is, as I mentioned, talk to the customers, but also try and figure out which ones do you sell the most of, and then start there. And don't try and do everything at once. Start small. Start with some of the groups you sell the most of. Engage with your customers. Put together like a plan on how you should tackle this one.
Okay, thank you again. Here's another one who are writing, we are supplying chemical fiber ropes such as HMPE rope for vessels. Since our product is very, very small part of a vessel, do you think Scope 3 will include every spare part of vessels? And will it be mandatory for ship owners to report this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think let's try and rewind the tape a little bit and see what are ship owners actually doing today. So I think 95% of all ship owners which are reporting their Scope 3 emissions at this time is using what's called the spend-based method. So they're actually using a financial spend within a certain category, and then they use an emission factor that can match this category. So they're using two variables, and they say, okay, we have $10,000 of spend within this category, and then they multiply it up. Now, naturally, when you only have two variables, you'll have an issue, because if the price goes up, or you have inflation, or you have other things that will affect your price, let's say it will increase, then your emissions will increase. And that will be a challenge, because as a ship owner, you won't be able to get a strategy in place which can include other factors such as greener products and products with lower emissions, because the only thing you have to measure on is either a standardized emission factor or a spend. So you will see over time ship owners which will start asking for data. And this is also part of the IMEF initiative, is to start substituting some of this spend-based data with activity-based. And this is what we're talking about in the IMEF initiative, is saying, let's get the activities, what goes into producing your product, and have that calculated. But going back to the question, I think what we need to do is also talk to your customers and say, how important is this category for you? And then you also need to go back and talk with your own company and say, where do we want to position ourselves and our product? Do we want to be known as a transparent brand that has the climate data? Do we want to be a low-cost product which people buy and not ask a lot of questions, or where in the product positioning matrix do you want to be? And that will also be a natural choice for you to say, is IMEF the first thing we should look at, or should we wait a little bit until our customers ask for it? But if you have customers where climate reporting is high on their agenda, then I would imagine that also the ropes is important, because they contain a lot of plastic material that is based on fossil fuel. So that could be interesting. But again, ask your customers and see where it is.
Thank you. I'm going to hit you another one. I believe we can all agree that it's impossible to instantly go from 0 to 100% of your Scope 3 emissions accounted for by the activity-based reporting method. Could ship owners use the activity-based method when applicable and then account for the rest by using spend-based reporting? If not, how will this gap be handled until everything can be accounted for by the activity-based method?
Yeah, so the activity-based method is all about looking at what goes in activities to create a product or a process, and the spend-based is all about the financial spend. Now, when we look at the current legislation and the current initiatives from at least the European Union, there are no guidelines saying you have to do the activity-based. So the spend-based is acceptable, but naturally it will have just two variables. So you will also see, as a ship owner, if you're looking to decarbonize, you're looking for more variables. I would imagine from where I'm sitting that there are ship owners which are substituting what they can with activity-based, and then they use the spend-based as a good enough on the categories they can't. And then over time, substituting the spend-based with the activity-based, because of course they won't stop reporting. They will still do what they have done last year, but they will enhance their data over time. So yeah, it's called a hybrid reporting method, and it is acceptable, and it will be good enough. But again, as I mentioned, you will see the ship owners are looking to increase their into activity-based, and that's also due to let's say you have products with lower emissions. You will need to document that using a activity-based. If you are if you are claiming that your product is green or have certain green attributes, then of course it's the activity-based. You can't use a spend-based method and say your product is green, because you won't be able to document it to the certain degree that for example, the European Union is requiring.
All right, thank you. Another one here. Good morning. Unfortunately, it seems that the industry is not ready for this kind of detailed reporting. For example, a lot of suppliers are not able to track and provide this kind of data, including transportation, storage, packaging, etc. Can you please advise on how to overcome such issues?
Yeah, so the IMEF initiative, as we have put it in the form it is right now, we are only looking at what's called cradle to gate. So that's the emissions produced within the manufacturing of the product. We are not in this scope right now looking at having producers to include supply chain outside the factory at this point. But again, if you really want to make a full calculation, you'll have to account for the entire life cycle. But that's also making, as you put in this question, it far more complicated. So I also think it's very important we don't overcomplicate things right now, but take it step by step as the data gets available. So for now, don't look at the logistics, but look at the manufacturing emissions, and then over time we can expand the scope from there once the data is available.
Okay. Then this one. The goal cannot be just the monitoring and measurement. While calculating and monitoring the highest sources of emissions that are crucial for implementing an effective emissions reduction strategy, what actually motivates buyers and suppliers now to take concrete actions towards reducing emissions?
Yeah, I think the first step to actually make change is to get a number of what you're doing today. If you can't count it, you can't change it, I would say, right? So the whole idea with the IMEF initiative is to start decarbonizing in a data-driven way. we have a lot of projects out there which are focusing on packaging, which is focusing on different type of initiatives. But when you approach these projects and ask for the numbers, they don't have it, but it seems like it's a good idea. I think we need to flip it upside down and say, let's get the numbers on the table first, and then we can look at all these different decarbonization strategies. Then you will also know which one is the best for your product or your supply chain. And then you can make the calculations. And I think as many products are different, many supply chains are different, it won't be the same decarbonization pathway for all of them. It will depend on a lot of things. So that's why I'm really excited about that we will see more suppliers actually getting what's called a baseline, getting the data in order, really getting the building blocks of their product in order, and then try and put these building blocks together in a better way. That's really, I think, is the goal. But that's to answer it back. If we can't count it, we can't make a difference, and we can't change it. So let's count it first. Let's get the building blocks in order, and then we can decarbonize.
And I just allow myself here to have a follow-up question on this, because this is something we've talked about the last couple of weeks and yesterday as well. We are seeing customers, or not customers, but companies out there making claims. And when you're asking, or I'm asking them to back it up by data, they cannot.
Yeah.
So you've been talking about a lot of making claims that you don't have the basics and the facts on, can lead to, you put in a greenwashing, so to speak. So you're actually putting yourself in danger of making claims that you can't back up by the right data, which again, what you just said, turned around, and we start with the data before, so we can make qualitative decisions on where to begin.
Absolutely. I think when you go around in different trade shows, SMM or North Shipping and so on, you'll see a lot of suppliers which will have a lot of claims saying green products, eco-friendly, sustainable, and so on. And I, at some of the exhibitions, I go around and ask, so how did you actually know? Well, one of them said, well, it's because that we use a different type of packaging. And then I'm like, so what do you do? Yeah, we use ocean plastic in our packaging. And then we say, well, how can this be better? Where's the numbers? Well, it's from the ocean, so it must be better. And I think that whole idea of having these, it must be better because this and that, well, sometimes you will be actually quite surprised, because what makes sense is not always the best thing for the environment. So ocean plastic, depending on how it's collected and treated and so on, can actually have a higher carbon footprint than regular plastics. So it is all about becoming data driven. And I also think if you are a supplier, why don't you get the data first and then make the change, because then it's also a much lower risk. If you look at some of the European Union initiatives right now, the greenwashing or false marketing claims initiatives out there, they are pretty steep right now. So if you are making unsubstantiated claims, you can actually risk several % of your global revenue in fines. So this is actually quite a big risk if you go out there and you can't substantiate.
Right.
But also on the other hand, Michael, if you then have the numbers and you have made your homework, then you will also probably have the confidence to go out and market your products in a different way. And that's the other thing. We also see companies doing the right thing, but because they don't have the numbers, they're afraid of telling the world that they are. So we actually see companies which are investing in green electricity and so on, but they don't tell anybody. And that's the other thing. Instead of greenwashing, it's called green hushing. And that's you're hushing yourself. You're keeping quiet. So also the other thing, let's get all the good stories out there. Let's put some numbers on it and inspire rest of the ship owners, rest of the suppliers, and make a good change.
Green hushing, that was a new one for me. We were just talking about on a panel yesterday here at IMPA regarding the sustainable ship supply, and we never really got an answer on that. So maybe this is exactly what you're talking about, that maybe we should hush a little bit less and start telling the world what we're doing good, how we back it up by data, and sharing, because it's caring.
I also think, Michael, it's very dangerous to put like absolute labels on stuff. So as you mentioned here, what is a sustainable supplier? What is a sustainable product? What is a green product? That can be very difficult and very expensive to document, to put, substantiate documentation on it. So my advice to many, if you're out there and you're looking to put some labels on, or to have some kind of a interaction where you want to show what you're doing, I think using a little bit vague terms like we are greener, or we are doing better, or we are on a, we are moving in a certain direction, that would be the right way in my ears, because you can't really go all the way and be an absolute sustainable product.
Right.
Because what is it actually? And isn't the bar changing as we become better and better and better? I would think so.
I hope so. So here's an EU question. And before I read it out, so no one gets confused listening to this, it has to do with EU, but also maybe you elaborate a little bit of what it means, even if you're a company working outside of the EU for you. So here's a question. Where does the CSRD compliance apply? Does it apply on the operations outside EU? EU vessel owner with vessels outside EU? Outside EU ship supplier supplying outside EU to vessels under EU flagged vessels? Here you go, Rasmus.
Yeah, well, that is a very complicated question, but let's try and break it down so we better understand it. So let's start with the first thing. What is CSRD? Yeah. CSRD stands for Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and it's part of the Green Deal from the European Union to put some reporting criteria in place. And this is actually, the whole idea is, let's start counting what we're doing today, because if we don't count, we can't make a change. So the whole idea with this CSRD is to say, let's get all the companies to actually include a sustainability reporting into their annual reporting. So the CSRD is going into effect, I believe, the next fiscal year. And the whole idea with the European Union is to say, now we need to include sustainability related reporting into it. One of the big things is what we call scope 3. So that's the supply chain emissions. But there is also 1,100 other parameters, which can include everything from water consumption to biodiversity to a lot of other metrics. But that's not relevant for all companies. So that's something that companies are going through an assessment internally right now called double materiality assessment, basically saying what is material for my company to report on. But one thing that is mandatory, and that's the scope 3. So the scope 3 is applicable for all companies which are falling under the CSRD reporting initiative. Now, who is falling under that, or who is this applicable to? So the European Union have said, well, we can't roll it out to all companies across the EU at once, because naturally that would be a big mouthful for many companies, because you'll need to put numbers on your supply chain, so that can be expensive. So what they're saying is, well, the largest corporations, according to the EU definition of a large corporation, the publicly traded companies, well, they have to comply as the first ones. So if you are a publicly traded company within the European Union, or you are characterized as a large corporation, that means the amount of employees or the balance sheet, you need to look up all the specific numbers. But if you are that, then you will need to do an annual reporting according to the CSRD. I think the biggest thing is, if you're a ship owner, or let's say you're a supplier outside the EU, this might not be relevant to you isolated as a Asian company or American company. But if you are dealing with ship owners where this is applicable to, well, then you will see that these ship owners are approaching their suppliers asking for data. So indirectly, it's going to be applicable for you. So, but that's where we're going to see it right now. But over time, the EU has the ambition to roll it out to all the other companies which are operating within the EU. So the medium-sized organizations, the smaller-sized organizations, the private companies, and so on. And they're also saying if you have representation within EU, you'll have to include it. So it's very ambitious as it is right now from the European Union. But I would also say, have a dialogue with your customers, which are founded within the EU, and ask them about what are their requirements over the next couple of years. Because there might be some companies which are below the CSRD threshold, where this is not relevant until a year from now or 2 years from now. And that will actually, if you're a supplier, get you some extra needed time to comply with that.
Okay, thank you. And the next question, the answer might be obvious, but I think we can repeat it. As most suppliers are negligent to such info at present, shouldn't a more collective approach by all be organized?
Yeah, so as most suppliers are negligent such info, I think actually what we were talking about is actually what we also need is education. We're looking at new knowledge out here. We're looking at a whole new vocabulary. We're looking at a whole new way of thinking, and something that we need to relate to in a brand new way. So I think to say, okay, if you're negligent, I don't know how I should put the word in that one, but I would translate it into you not knowing about it. Well, then some training could be relevant. And I also think as a company, if you want to work with the IMEF initiative or climate-related activities, of course you need to make sure that who is responsible for this have some kind of a basic knowledge and understanding on the area.
And if I may, I think the question was, maybe it was misunderstood by the listener, because we are actually doing a collective approach, the way I see it. That is what the IMEF is all about. We are providing a methodology for the industry to work together hand in hand with owners and hand in hand with suppliers. So we do the same thing, so we can meet future standards that we think is coming, and maybe we can even set the standard or helping the IMO down the line on how this should be done, so to support everybody.
Yeah, I think the first step is let's sit around the table, and I think the scenario we don't want is that we have, for example, ship owners that are dictating how everybody in the supply chain to make their calculations. I think right now we have an opportunity to get around the table and talk about how should we do it over the next couple of years. We know we need to go there, but this initiative is great because now everybody can be heard, from the chandler to the big ship owner to the small ship owner to the small OEM to the large OEM, and everybody involved now have a voice. And I also think that's also a call to action to everybody sitting out there and saying, well, IMEF is not relevant for me right now. Well, can you afford not to look at this? Can you afford to just ignore it? Because, as you know, we will need to report on it at some point. If you have anything to do with the EU or your customers have, then this is where we need to go. So get your voice heard.
I'm going to finish up with 2 more questions, Rasmus, and then we have to end this, even though we could sit here and talk for hours.
Yeah.
So the question is, what are the requirements to be a member of the IMEF initiative, and what are the expectations of a member? How will information about product level emissions be shared with other members?
Yeah, so going back to the requirements to become a member, I think and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Mikael, but the whole idea is not to say who is a member and who is not a member. It is to support the initiative and to be part of the initiative. It's not a club. This is a movement, you could say. This is a initiative where we get together and we listen to each other, and we all have a voice, and we help shape the direction we're going. So I would say it's not about becoming a member, but you can definitely sign up, and you can become a part of the initiative. And I think, Mikael, that would be to contact you, right? And sign up. And there is also a IMPA IMEF website where you can show your interest, and from there you will get contacted.
Yeah, they sign up from the www.impasave.org, and there you can find the IMEF, and there you can sign up and just follow
Yeah,
But,
going back to the last thing about information about product level emissions shared with other members. I think that is a dangerous path, right? Because the whole idea with the initiative is not to share the calculations. It is to get a better understanding on how they should be calculated. As the initiative is looking right now, we're not shaming anybody for having higher numbers than others and so on, because we are in the very infant stage of making calculations. And this is also the stage where companies can get a better understanding. So I personally, I don't think we should be sharing anything. I think it's up to the individual companies to share the data with their customers and request the data from their suppliers. But this is also a change management challenge, also internally. So let's learn from it and not start sharing stuff left and right. But of course, the ultimate goal is to share it with your customers.
Right. Last question, and this kind of relates to one of the slides that I know you've used for a couple of years. It's a slide where you have the black fuel ship.
Yeah.
And it's a slide where you have the green, like the methanol or ammonium fuel ship. So the question goes like this. Can you please clarify why the green fuel, the scope 3 emissions, increase so much in comparison with the conventional fuels on those two slides?
Yeah, so if you look at those slides, the whole idea is you have one vessel which is using fossil fuel. The fossil fuel will, of course, have a scope 3 emission and also have a scope 1. Now, the scope 1, since it's a fossil source, will be fairly high. And actually, the scope 3 on the fossil fuel, we don't really count today. When we look at the IMO guidelines, we're using something called tank to wake. So on the IMO guidance, you don't want to count the scope 3. But according to the GHG protocol, you will need to account for the scope 3. So this is actually quite important that you'll need to account for that. Now, when you look at green methanol or green ammonia, you are using a biogenic source. So the scope 1 is coming from the nature and going back to the nature on how it's defined. So the scope 1 is not significant. But the big thing is actually the scope 3, because how are you producing this green ammonia or green methanol? Now, there is no established standardized supply chain for these fuels yet. So there are many different ways you can produce it using different energy sources and different processes. And these all have a carbon footprint somehow within all these steps. Also, logistics involved in transporting the fuels will actually also have a step. So this is all the scope 3 emissions. And since you are looking at a biogenic source on the green methanol or green ammonia, you will naturally see where the biggest footprint you have on these fuels will be from the scope 3, the whole production and sourcing of these fuels. So that's why once you look at the numbers, you will see that the scope 3 is such a big portion of the emissions of a vessel when you're using green fuels.
All right. Thank you for elaborating on that. Rasmus, this comes to the end of the questions. There are a few more, but I think you answered them already, so I'm not going to repeat those. Thank you so very much for spending a bit of time over coffee here with me, responding to these questions from all our listeners. And obviously...
You're welcome, Michael. It's great, and it's actually interesting to sit here in Singapore and just taking half an hour out in a busy schedule to just reflect about these good questions, because the questions are spot on. We are looking at different stakeholders within the industry where this is brand new to them. So I actually encourage everybody to ask more questions and come forward. There's no stupid questions. We all need to learn together.
Yeah, and as I said, it's free to sign up for the IMEF, and it's the right thing to do, to be enlightened and informed about what we're doing. Even if you don't feel like you're ready for it, this is the first step of learning. So from me, it's over and out here in Singapore.
Also for me, thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you very much, Rasmus.
Bye-bye.
Bye.